This is the Art of Darkness podcast with Kevin Kautzman.
And Brad Kelly. We're a couple of very online writers interested in the dark side of what drives creative people to create against all odds.
This show is about art and the people who make it, what it costs them, and what it takes to bring something unique and impactful into the world.
Each episode, we excavate the life and work of an artist you might think you know.
Don't worry, they're all safely dead.
On every episode, we try and find out just what the hell was wrong with them and how they worked through their darkness to create something that lives on after them and continues to move culture.
Find us online at artofdarkpod.com and on Twitter at artofdarkpod. I feel misled. I feel let down.
It's not your fault. It's not your fault. Yeah.
No.
Yeah. You read a whole book on it.
I'm so gullible. I'm such a sucker.
Okay. Let's see. Yeah, so this travel was sanctioned. He had letters of introduction from the Queen Elizabeth. So anywhere he went, he would have this letter of introduction sealed by the Queen. He met on the way to Italy. He met the King and Queen of France, for instance. There was some attempts to get him to meet the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian II. Apparently, that didn't happen. We don't know a whole lot about what he was doing in Italy, because Edward de Vere was not a guy who kept journals, and he didn't write the kind of correspondence that might share a lot of biographical detail. Mostly when he wrote something, he was trying to get something out of somebody. So
yeah, he's just like me for real.
Yeah.
If I send you a postcard, I want something from you.
Right. Yeah. So there wasn't just a lot of, hey, how you doing? So I'm down here, and there wasn't any of that. It was like, send me money. Send me my money. Damn it. Yeah. But like I said, we know he spent time in France. We know he spent time in Strasbourg with John Sturmius, who was an intellectual leader of European Protestantism. We know that he either bought or built a house in Venice. He was rumored to have been somehow involved with a killing in Padua in which two Englishmen were involved, but little else is known about this. He traveled throughout the country, though, of Italy, even perhaps reaching Sicily, as is accounted in a book entitled Travel Journals, published in 1590. But let me read this bit, because this bit kind of cracked me up about something else that happened in Italy. He's having his Fade Ralph a moment here. Quote, possibly Oxford visited even more of Italy during the year. Edward Webb's Travels, published in 1590, suggested that Oxford reached Sicily. I just said that, but here's the actual bit from that book. Quote, many things I have omitted to speak of, which I have seen and noted in time of my troublesome travel. One thing did greatly comfort me, which I saw long since in Sicilia, in the city of Palermo, a thing worthy of memory, where the right honorable Earl of Oxford, a famous man of chivalry, at what time he traveled into foreign countries, being then personally present, made there a challenge against all manner of persons whatsoever, and had all manners of weapons, as tournaments, barriers with horse and armor, to fight a combat with any whatsoever in the defense of his prince and country, prince being the queen, for which he was very highly commended, and yet no man durst be so hardy to encounter him, so that all Italy over he is acknowledged the only chevalier and nobleman of England. This title they give unto him as worthily deserved. He goes to Italy, and he just challenges anybody who might want to step up to a knife fight or a sword fight or a joust or however you want to roll. I'll take you on. Nobody went for it, but I just find it hilarious that he's, stomping around foreign country, just challenging people to fight. Because that's how he is. Let's see what else is going on in his sort of gap year here. He's I do like the idea of Oxford's gap year.
Right. Yeah. De Vere's gap year.
Yeah, it's good stuff. And it's funny how petty he is too, because he's basically just abandoned his wife, right, and left Lord Burleigh, the most powerful man in the country, in charge of his finances. And then De Vere writes him these bitchy letters about how asking about how some estate is doing. And it's like, this guy's taking care of you your whole life. Like, why aren't you being halfway decent to him ever? Um, yeah. Now, another thing that people claim, the Oxfordians will claim about this time in Italy is that, and this does make sense, that he was getting a significant upgrade in his education. We don't have specific documentation to this. It might not be true at all, but this would have been a place where he would have learned a bunch of stuff you might not be able to learn in England at the time. We do know that he spoke Italian fluently by the end of his time there. And, let's give you a couple specific things from his time in Italy that maybe showed up in the plays. Here's one. The character Battista Minola is a character from Taming of the Shrew. And we know that there's two people that he borrowed money from in Venice, Baptista Negroni and Pasquina Spinola, right? It's kind of perhaps he smashed these names together to make a character.
It's two popular drinks that we've heard here.
Yeah.
We've Negroni and Bloody Mary.
Yeah. History will be experienced first as tragedy and then as cocktail.
Yeah, I'll have a Brad Kelly.
Yeah.
And it's like a THC drink mixed with like Guinness and I guess the tears of a writer. And a Couchman is just warm vodka.
It's room temperature.
Give me a Couchman. Give me some of that room temperature vodka
in like a coffee mug. Like,
right. And the number for a nursing line. And boy. Writer's tears.
Yeah. A little bit of that in there. A little bit. Yeah, dash. Here's another thing, Merchant of Venice, which is set in Venice. He lived in Venice, right? So there should be something in there. Well, in The Merchant of Venice, a significant part of the plot is that a man named Shylock, character named Shylock, loans 3,000 ducats to the main character. Well, in Italy, Oxford borrowed 3,000 pounds from a man named Michael Locke. Not exactly on the nose, but kind of. Yeah.
Was Michael Locke of the Hebrew persuasion? Do we know?
We don't know that for sure. He might have been, but we don't know that. I don't think we know that for sure.
Man, listen, again, I love this idea that the fellow who may have written most or all of these plays was just a rotten, spoiled bastard.
Yeah.
We have this idea somehow that genius somehow like would make somebody morally pure too. Somehow, like, no.
No,
quite the opposite.
Not at all.
So again, very interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean that's what's kind of cool. This is actually what makes it kind of a great Art of Darkness episode, right? Dark side of creativity. It's like, imagine that this guy wrote Shakespeare. What does that mean for the work of Shakespeare?
Right, and how convenient for the world that we don't have a biography of this guy, so it can never be troubled. It's just vapor, and so you get to project all of your anything you want onto it, and the troubles in the work just get to be like, well, that was of the time, like the bigotry and the sexism, and well, he was a man of his time, but he was a commoner. He was like us.
Right.
Yeah, I can see. Very, very interesting.
Yeah,
I might leave it Oxfordian. I'm leaning that way slightly.
Yeah, I am too, and there is always more. And here, this is the thing. I haven't made the Stratfordian case, obviously, but there is, every time I give you some correspondence, that's one of several. Like, we don't have time to go through all of them. There's more. I'm not giving you every correspondence between the work and the man. This is a handful of them. There are way more than this. Other matchups between De Vere's time in Italy and the plays. In Winter's Tale, there is a statue carved by Julio Romano. This is the only artist that Shakespeare ever names by name in a play, apparently, according to the Oxfordians. Now, for years, apparently, according to the Oxfordians, critics had basically said that Shakespeare got it wrong, because in the play, in A Winter's Tale, Shakespeare says that Julio Romano was a sculptor. It had sculpted something, and critics had said, no, that's not correct. And even some critics apparently had used this as an example of, see, he made mistakes. He didn't know everything, right? He didn't have this world-class education. He fumbled all the time, and it was fine because the play is still great. Turns out that whoever wrote the Shakespeare plays was right all along, and Giulio Romano was also a sculptor. But this is only something you would have known if you were in Venice or in Italy at the cultural heartbeat of this stuff, right? There's another thing. Oxfordians will tell you that Oxford must have at some point visited the studio of the great Italian Renaissance painter Titian. Why do they say this? Because it turns out that in the first text attributed to Shakespeare, the 1593 poem Venus and Adonis, the writer, whoever they may be, the writer of this poem makes reference to a description of Venus and Adonis that lines up with a painting of Titian in which Adonis is wearing a bonnet. According to the Oxfordians, you would only have this description of Adonis if you had seen the painting in Venice. There's no way Willie Shakes would have seen that painting.
Unless Willie Shakes, the Vapor Man,
Yeah.
Willie Shakes somehow had traveled to Italy.
Right. Yeah. And again, you can't, I mean, there's no point in saying this, but like trying to emphasize this, like you can be a genius, but if you don't have access to things, you don't have access to them. You just can't. Right. I mean, yeah. Right. And I also mentioned the thing about Ovid's Metamorphosis, Venus and Adonis pulling a quote from a translation of Ovid's Metamorphosis that was not publicly available, but had been written or been translated and produced by De Vere's uncle. And De Vere and his uncle were close. In fact, De Vere was his uncle's patron. Okay. What else is De Vere up to in Italy? Vice. Just broadly stated. He lived in Italy, among other things, whatever education he may have got. He lived in Italy to have a good time. Let me read you a little bit from a letter written by a gentleman named Powell to his brother describing Italy. This is just what Italy was like according to the English at the time. Quote, to speak in general what I think of Italy, I must needs confess to have found a very flourishing country and a fruitless people. I have seen many beautified cities with gorgeous buildings, but polluted and deformed inhabitants with vicious behavior, fortified towns with artificial bulwarks and standing walls, but weak captains with ruinous manners that yield up to every assault of sensuality, many relics of dead saints, but more monuments of living Saracens for religion, and devilish serpents for life. To say in a word, I have found an evil people and a good land. The Italian is in behavior civil and sociable, and of nature courageous and merry. He hateth all melancholic humors, and therefore delighteth in masking, dancing, musical instruments, pleasant gardens, beautiful pictures, and dainty dames, accounting religion but policy to keep men within the compass of some honest limits, preaching to be but prattling of friars and monks, all inordinate pleasures to be but solaces of nature. Okay, here's another. Thomas Nash is what he had to say about Italy. Quote, Italy, the paradise of the earth and the epicure's heaven, how doth it form our young master? It makes him to kiss his hand like an ape, cringe his neck like a starveling, and play at hay pass repass come aloft when he salutes a man. From thence he brings the art of atheism, the art of epicurizing, the art of whoring, the art of poisoning, the art of sodometry. So
we got a new one, sodometry. We got sodomy and sodometry. When the sodomy becomes mathematical, when the sodomy becomes like you've got a compass and you're figuring it out, and this goes there, and
you got some draft paper.
Right, I love it. The real study of sodometry.
Right. If you make like a scale model before you engage
before you get down. That rocks. So I love it, dude. It's like, oh God, you're sending your son to Italy. Oh boy.
Yeah. I was like, shoot, why does he want to go to Italy? Right.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. So he also had a mistress there. De Vere did, a woman named Virginia Pedona. She was almost certainly a prostitute as well. Again, perhaps for people who don't know, there is the Shakespeare sonnets, published, I think, in 1609. They kind of have two parts. They have To the Fair Youth, part, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And then they have the Dark Lady poems, and poetry to a woman who has darkish skin, dark eyes, dark hair, and nobody knows who this woman is, right? And I think Stratfordians will tend to claim like, oh, she's just totally fictitious. I don't. I mean, maybe she is. It seems, but De Vere had had sexual relations with at least one and probably a bunch of darker Mediterranean women. So I'll just say that, I guess. He also got what is called in England the Neapolitan malady, which is syphilis. He probably acquired syphilis in Italy.
Neapolitan malady, and it's when your junk turns vanilla, chocolate, and strawberry.
See, I thought it was when you had the tub of the ice cream and somebody had eaten your favorite flavor completely, and that was gone.
That's so sad.
I don't know which is yours.
I got
Mine
a
is
bad
strawberry.
case of,
I like the strawberry.
I got a bad case of strawberry dick.
Right.
Pick that up down in old Verona.
Right.
Yeah. Syphilis. Everybody had that. It was all going around, and they had no real cure for it, and drive you mad slowly.
Yeah, we don't know if like later on he had how much this affected his health, and we don't know 100% that he had syphilis, but we do have from some letters the notion that he most likely had some kind of venereal disease, and so
let me play devil's advocate here, Brad.
Yeah.
When does he have time here to write these plays?
This is a great question. Yeah.
Where
now? Yeah. Now the period that we're in now is in the 1570s, right? And nothing comes out. The Venus and Adonis poetry doesn't come out until 1593. So part of the Shakespeare, the Oxfordian case is either that Oxford got started late or that he published these poems or these plays earlier, or wrote these plays earlier, and they didn't come out until later. He would have been 43 years old when Venus and Adonis came out. So yeah, it's a good point. It is a good question. I thought about that a lot in here. Here is something else, because he wasn't just in Italy. He wasn't just, let me just read it. Quote, Oxford's adventures in Italy were not only heterosexual, but homosexual and pederastic. Henry Howard testifies. Now, Henry Howard was kind of an enemy of his, so we got to take this with a grain of salt, but he's not the only person who said this. So, quote, this is what Henry Howard said. Quote, touching buggery, Oratio, the Italian boy, complained how horribly my lord had abused him and yet would not give him anything in the way of medical relief. Charles Arundel, another enemy of Oxford, would later attribute the boy's departure from Oxford's service to the same cause. Quote, a ratio that came with him out of Italy made it the quarrel of his departure, as Henry Locke can testify. Quote, Locke, as we shall learn, had been Oxford's servant as early as 1571 and perhaps accompanied him to Italy. Orazio Cuqua was the object of Oxford's affection. He literally brought a young Italian boy home with him to England.
It's not like the same. It's not like it doesn't happen now.
I mean, sure.
Yeah. We do a little light sex trafficking, don't we?
Yeah.
He's a mobster. Yeah. This guy's like a mobster, a bad dude.
Yeah.
Dude, I would love for this to be now for reasons, put class aside. Yeah. I just would love for this to be Shakespeare because, again, it's a bunch of hooey. The other stuff, the reverence for Shakespeare. What if it's all horse shit? Like that to me seems so much more honest and real, knowing what we do about the nature of art and artists than
Sweet Swan of Avon.
Sweet Swan of Avon.
Just channeling all the best of that the muses had to offer.
He really is. Shakespeare really is a secular saint. And like this would tear that to shreds. And people really can't have that. You cannot have that.
I think that's part of the
reason.
Let anything in.
Right. Yeah. And it's tied up with Anglo identity too. So it's like how wonderful to have a vaporware so that there's never anything ad hominem you can say against the man. Instead, you just have the work. In a way, it's sort of like how we on Art of Darkness kind of want art to be received, but leave it to the eternal Anglo to create this national poet who is beyond reproach because he never existed.
Right.
Like what? Maybe they did do that. Maybe that's what they did. Who can blame them? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Fascinating.
yeah. Now after 10 months or so, he Oxford de Vere returns from England. This is when he's taken by pirates, is on this return trip, and they steal pretty much
Well,
everything he brought.
and that's what happens in
Yeah,
Hamlet too, right? Oh,
yeah,
geez.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And again, in Hamlet, it's an old story, but that's an invention. That plot point was not in the previous Hamlet versions, right? Um, he was very upset about being ambushed by pirates, especially because they'd stole all of the Italian clothes that he'd bought. He bought all these dope threads when he was in Italy, and he was going to come back to England and be the number one dandy, and all of it got ripped off. Um, yeah, okay. Now, back in England. All right. So per Alan Nelson, this guy who wrote Monstrous Adversary, he gets back to England and there's not a big change in behavior. It just kind of ramps up, right? But let's go through a few of them and we'll start with the good. Patronage. What no one denies is that Edward de Vere was a major patron of the arts. He was a dedicatee of many printed books, and generally, when a nobleman appeared in a dedication, it was because he had funded the authors writing it. Between 1564 and 1580, 12 different books had a dedication to Oxford, and 4 had dedications to his wife. Probably the most successful of these were his uncle Arthur Golding's, quote, The Abridgment of the Histories of Trogus Pompeius, and also a book of the Psalms of David with commentary by Calvin. In 1580, Oxford would take over the Earl of Warwick's company of actors, and apparently their early performances caused some issues. Let me just read a little bit. This is the Lord Mayor of London's letter of complaint about one of the early performances of the Earl of Warwick's men. Do I have the right page here? Doesn't seem like the right page. Quote. Oh, do I not have the right section? Oh, anyway, the I can just summarize it. The Earl of Oxford took over the Earl of Warwick's men. On their first performance, somebody basically said something offensive to them, and the Earl's men beat the crap out of him at the performance.
This is the kind of energy that we need to get back, right? Like going to the theater should feel like going to some sort of
Yeah,
underground
yeah,
rap battle in the
right,
90s in
right.
Detroit.
Yeah,
Like
some
people
little
should be
dirt, like
there could be a fight. There could be a fight. It
yeah,
should feel like going to
something could
like
happen.
maybe the club, you know?
Yeah,
But
yeah. You gotta
instead
watch yourself a little bit.
it's all up
Yeah,
its own
yeah,
ass, you know? And
yeah,
it may have something to do with the fact that they've created this vaporware Shakespeare who's above reproach, who's the
yeah.
idol of the English language theater. It's just,
Right.
the most bourgeois thing, the most middle class thing you could ever do is to not exist.
Mm. Yeah, that's right. That's true. That's pretty good. I like that.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
that's the reason that we do this podcast is
Yeah,
insights like that.
yeah, indeed.
Yeah, and Brad, you're bringing it in. You're doing a great job. We're like what 2.5 hours. I'm just going to give
Yeah,
you a real quick break and like do some plugs. We've got
yeah.
book
I'm gonna
club coming
use the
up. Yeah,
restroom
go
actually.
take a break. Yeah, go take a break. We got book club coming up. We are reading The Passenger and Stella Maris by the great Cormac McCarthy. The date is at artofdarkpod.com. I'm going over there right now just to make sure I get the date absolutely correct. This is for our subs and our doms on Substack and Patreon, respectively. Everybody gets the same thing. If you sign up for one, you get the same thing that the other group gets. It's all about supporting the pod, gets you in the door $5 a month. You can join the book club. You can actually join us on Zoom for it and participate and be part of the recording, or you can just lurk in the background. You don't have to join us, on the day, and you can listen back to the recording and enjoy the book club that way. Of course, the great Cormac McCarthy died a year ago or so. We're getting ready to do the episode. We're very excited for that. And so we included that in the book club. We're going to be doing that on July 13th. That is coming up very soon. Get in, support the pod. I said earlier we kind of plateaued on Patreon. We're doing great. We appreciate all the subscribers, but let's get that number up. Help us. If you've been listening to this podcast for a while, you listen to both the Shakespeare episodes. Think about it. Think about subscribing and getting in there. We do a bunch of other bonus stuff for patrons, for the subs and the doms, as we say. And the rest of the year for the book club, we're going to read Billy Budd from Melville, The Left Hand of Darkness from Le Guin, and then Dune, my podcast, my book club, my Dune. on December 15th. And all the details are at artofdarkpod.com. This is a little bittersweet because Brad is recording here probably the last time from that studio. And people who are listening on YouTube or watching on YouTube, you know Brad's funky studio in the background there. And that's going to change here in the near future. They're moving to a new house. And I am between places right now. But for the next couple of months, I'm actually going to be coming from the University Club here in St. Paul, which F. Scott Fitzgerald, friend of the pod, frequented. So you're going to see another new background for me for a couple of months, and having a great time, Brad. I was just plugging the book club, telling the subs and the doms, thank you. And we got some great stuff for After Dark. We always do. I know Brad's gonna sling some heat there. And so,
yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I really just, the last thing I'm gonna say before I go step off and get a little bit of water is, like, whether or not we gave you anything extra, I really hope if you've listened to 3, 5, 10 of these core episodes that you would consider chucking in $5 a month, $10 a month, whatever you can afford to support this podcast. Because if we're going to continue doing it for another 5, 10 years, we're going to need material support. It buys books. It buys, I got to travel to Detroit for this live show.
Yeah.
It just lets us do more and more stuff. The more we can give more energy to the pod, the more material support we see. We love giving this away it is true. And it's a shot in the arm every time we see a new subscriber. So we really appreciate it. And all right, Brad, take it away. Bring us into the back half of old Eddie de Vere.
We're well on our way. Yes,
okay,
sir.
right on. I'm gonna grab some water, but I am listening. All right.
Okay. Yeah. So we were talking about the patronage. We were talking about, his players getting into fights at shows. We should make a small comment just on theater in general. So apparently in 1580 there was a major earthquake. A few people died, but earthquakes are very uncommon in England, right? And so people were very scared, and there were a number of pamphlets written about basically saying that the reason that there was an earthquake was because God was pretty pissed off about the theater. And I find that, hey, maybe they're right? Now we tend to get exaggerated reports about what Oxford's company was up to, and we really don't know the nature of these shows exactly. But we do know that, well, let me just read this bit that I found in the Nelson biography. Let me see if I can I don't want to read too much of it. Let's see. So yeah, this is good. Okay. This is written by an anonymous writer. Let's see. I'm laughing because this is pretty good. This is about the performance. An Edward de Vere's players, one of their performance. Quote, "The field, a fart dirty, a gibbet cross-corded, a dancing dame, flirty of all men aboard, a lither lad stampet, a roge in his rags, a whore that is rampant, astride with her legs, a woodcock displayed, a calf and a sheep, a bitch that is splayed, a dormouse asleep, a viper in stinch, la part de la drute, spell backward this French, and crack me that nut." Right. And it's basically, it's pretty obscure for us now, but it's basically like playing on the word turd. It's very scatological. Party papillary, pierced with a rope, to slide the more lithery, anointed with soap, a coxcomb cross-spate in token of wit, 2 ears perforate, a nose with a slit, 3 nettles resplendent, 3 owls, 3 swallows, 3 minstrel men pendant on 3 pair of gallows, further sufficiently placed in them a knave's head for a difference from all honest men. Okay. I don't expect you as the audience to follow what exactly the poet was saying, and I don't particularly either. But the general point of this is a poem about a performance of the Oxford players. Is their shows were chaos. It was not when we think of a play, we think of sitting down, a curtain opens, a story begins, we follow it from beginning to end, the action rises and falls. This was more like it sounds like it was a little bit more like a freak show. We do know for a fact that at one point Oxford's men had perfected some kind of disappearing act, so there may have been an element of like a magic show to it. There seems to be, quote, what did he say? A whore that is rampant astride with her legs. There were probably bawdy or burlesque elements to it. It sounds like there were animals involved, perhaps at certain times. It sounds like a pretty wild show, much like the Art of Darkness live show, October 26th.
Hamtram it. We're gonna have a. Is it official? We're gonna have an opener, right? You're
Yeah,
arranging that.
yeah. I'm still working on that, but we'll have it. Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yep.
Okay. The opener isn't gonna die, are they? No.
Well, I
It
mean,
remains to be
define
seen.
die.
Yeah. Right. What
Yeah.
is? Yeah. If you die in Detroit, do you really die?
Right. You become a
You're
legend. Yeah. Yeah. Now, apparently Oxford's Men went on tour. There are records of them performing broadly throughout the theatrical season over the next few years. In 1583, Oxford would take over the lease of the Blackfriars Theatre, as we discussed, and that's a place where many Shakespeare plays would be performed. He gave this theater to his friend and servant John Lilly, who became himself was somewhat of a noted dramatist of the day. So we're talking about this patronage aspect of his return to England after his license travel to Italy, right? Some other patronage things he got involved with. He had a troupe of tumbling boys that would do some kind of vaulting act. Um, whether he had other use for the tumbling boys is a matter of debate, right? Quote unquote. Yeah. Tumbling boys. Apparently, Lord Burleigh says in a letter that he refers to a servant that Oxford kept near him as a tumbling boy. It was apparently a kid from the troupe that just kind of hung out with Oxford. So he was just hanging out with some young, somewhat muscular tumbling boy on a regular basis. And when I say boy, he was probably 12. I think in the stuff I was looking at, 12 to 14, probably in that range, maybe 16 at the most. Now, Oxford's Men, his troupe, their activity varies over time, but we do see in the Stationer's Register that they were performing as late as 1600, though. I do want to point out here as a sort of one Stratfordian thing, there is no documented connection between Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, and Lord Chamberlain's Men, Shakespeare's company. They would have been De Vere's company and the Lord Chamberlain's Men would have been active at the same time, but there's no documentary primary evidence to suggest any link between the two, other than some association due to Blackfriars Theatre. And they're both in London and the surrounding areas, right? And also, there has been some confusion over time that they're referred to as Lord Chamberlain's Men. De Vere had the title of Lord Great Chamberlain, which is not the same as being Lord Chamberlain. They're two different things. So that's one little piece of Stratfordian. Just, we don't want to imply any connections that aren't there. I'm trying to give you what has actually been kind of substantiated. Okay. Now, Oxford's actual contribution to theater in terms of writing is debatable. And if we're going to argue that he wrote the plays of Shakespeare, we should at least see the fingerprints of an ability somewhere around it, right? The ability to put together a body show with livestock and some kind of scatological element doesn't tell us anything about whether the guy can write Hamlet, right? Just means he likes being in front of an audience. But we do have some reference to him as a playwright. Edward de Vere received a prominent place in an anonymous work entitled The Art of English Poesy, which was written in 1589 and is regarded as the central text of Elizabethan courtly politics. Quote, his position in the world of letters had already been stated unequivocally in 1586 when William Webb declared in A Discourse of English Poetry, quote, I may not omit the deserved commendations of many honorable and noble lords and gentlemen in her majesty's court, which in the rare devices of poetry have been and yet are most skillful, among whom the right honorable Earl of Oxford may challenge himself the title of the most excellent among the rest. On the very next page, the anonymous author of the Art of English Poesy names a few playwrights. He says, quote, for tragedy, Lord Buckhurst and Master Edward Ferrys do deserve the highest praise. The Earl of Oxford and Master Edwards of Her Majesty's Chapel for comedy and interlude. So people were writing about the Earl of Oxford as a writer of some note. It, you know, the one thing maybe we haven't talked about here is it wasn't it wasn't a good look for a nobleman to be involved in the theater. Patronizing it was one thing, but writing
Sure.
it yourself was a
It's
different thing.
Well, it's labor.
Yeah.
It's kind of work.
Mhm.
I mean, and you're putting
Right.
yourself on display, and
Hmm.
yeah, very strange. Hmm.
Yeah. And you could write poetry in your quote idle hours. You might share a poem with your friend, but you weren't supposed to like try and turn into a business. You weren't supposed to like, it was beneath you. Now we also said we read a bit of one of his poems earlier. Oxford did write poetry. About 20 of these poems survive. Um, yeah, here's what somebody had to say. A man named W.J. Courthope, he said this in the 1890s, and this was before anybody suspected De Vere of being Shakespeare, except for perhaps some people during his own lifetime. He had this to say, quote, Oxford's own verses are distinguished for their wit and in their terse ingenuity reflect something of the coxcombry which seems to have been a leading feature in his character. Coxcombry is just like a wild boy, my understanding. Um, Doubtless he was proud of his illustrious ancestry and of his own office of Great Chamberlain of England. He was, therefore, careful to conform, in his verse at least, to the external requirements of chivalry, as may be seen in his sonnet Love Thy Choice, which has something of the old-fashioned air of Surrey and may have been a youthful composition. But in later years, his natural turn for epigram seems to have prevailed over his chivalrous sentiment, as may be seen in the famous lines beginning, If woman would be fair and yet not fond. Oxford was a contributor to the Paradise of Dainty Devices, and here his sententiousness takes the shape of devotional poems in Lord Vaux's manner. But on the whole, the epigram, pure and simple, seems to have been his favorite form of composition, and in this his studied concinnity of style is remarkable, as the following examples will show. And then he gives you some examples. Concinnity means beauty of style, basically, produced by skillful connection of words. Let's read just a couple of his poems, and people can tell. The audience can say whether or not this sounds like this guy could have also written, say, the sonnets. Yeah, this is one called "The Lively Lark." Quote. The lively lark stretched forth her wing, the messenger of morning bright, and with her cheerful voice did sing the day's approach discharging night. When that aurora blushing red descried the guilt of Thetis' bed, I went abroad to take the air, and in the meadows I met a knight, clad in carnation color fair. I did salute this gentle wight, of him I did his name inquire. He sighed and said he was Desire. Desire, I did desire to stay. A while with him I craved to talk. The courteous knight said me no nay, but hand in hand with me did walk. Then of Desire I asked again, what thing did please and what did pain? He smiled, and thus he answered then, Desire can have no greater pain than for to see another man that he desireth to obtain. Nor greater joy can be than this, than to enjoy the other's miss. And what's interesting about this is there's a strain of cruelty in it. He's basically saying the best pleasure you kind of have for the best pleasure, somebody else has to suffer a little bit.
Like an ode to Schadenfreude.
Yeah, kind
Well,
of,
and
right?
then to enjoy the other's miss is of course, a double entendre as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm. Yep,
at least.
exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So pretty clever. Again, I don't know whether that's the same voice that could have done Shakespeare's sonnets or not. Here is another little one. Quote, When wert thou born, Desire, in pomp and prim of May? By whom, sweet boy, wert thou begot? By good conceit, men say. Tell me, who was thy nurse, fresh youth and sugared joy? What was thy meat and daily food? Sad sighs with great annoy. What hadst thou then to drink? Unfeigned lovers' tears. What cradle wert thou rocked in hope devoid of fears? So, now let's read, Shakespeare's sonnet number 29. I just wrote that. I should read that in here. I didn't put a link. So give me 1 second. They're not hard to find a
That's not that
Shakespeare
hard to
sonnet.
find. Yeah, there's a
Yeah.
lot of material on old Edward de Vere.
Yeah. Yes, sir. Yeah. Let's see if I can get my hold on. Hold on. There we go. Sonnet number 29. And I'm reading this for a specific purpose that I'm going to tie into the biography here in a second. Quote, when in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I fell alone, beweep my outcast state, and trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries, and look upon myself and curse my fate, wishing me like to know to one more rich in hope, featured like him with friends possessed, desiring this man's art and that man's scope, with what I most enjoy contented least. Yet in these thoughts myself most despising, haply I think on thee and then my state, like to the lark at break of day, arising from sullen earth, sings hymns at heaven's gate. For thy sweet love remembered such wealth brings, that then I scorn to change my state with kings. Okay. That's a well-known sonnet. One thing I want to point out in this is, okay, he said lark there and you use it kind of metaphorically the same in the Lively Lark poem. I don't make too much of that. But one thing that I do find interesting is the fact that this sonnet, and I think there's a couple of others, seem to convey Shakespeare, the writer of this poem, their sense that they're outcast from the common run of humans, that their reputation has been besmirched somehow and they've been kind of cast out. Um, we don't really have a sense that that ever happened to Shakespeare. We don't know that that happened from the biography. That totally happened to Oxford. By the end of his life, he was a farce. And we're gonna see why. We're getting there. Okay. Now, again, we continue to see the patterns of his youth continue into adulthood. A big one of these is violence. We get continuing complaints from staff about his violence and his anger. Um, he would often retaliate. He accepted nothing but loyalty, right? He had like an omerta thing, just like the mafia, apparently. He's on record for having threatened a doctor of his wife for reasons that are not completely understood. Um, Apparently, based on his first daughter, somebody had told him something untrue about the gestation period of a human child. And so when he got back from England, he believed that his first daughter couldn't possibly be his based on the timing of it. But he was wrong. But somebody had lied to him about how long it takes for babies to be born.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wasn't in any of the books that he had, huh?
Right. Apparently. Well, apparently not. Yeah. It's an interesting, weird little thing. But he didn't believe that his first daughter was his for a very long time. And you
That
know,
that can
and then
create some problems.
yeah,
Yeah,
for
especially with
sure.
this like kind of unhinged literary genius who also
Right.
wielded a sword.
Right, exactly. In 1577, this is kind of backing up a little bit, but just talking about violence, there seems to have been another murder by a former De Vere associate by one of De Vere's men for reasons that are very tricky to extract. Just kind of pointing out that this violence seems to have been kind of commonplace. Um, Also, as I said, he brought an Italian boy back from Italy. And the boy stayed in England for about a year. The boy eventually did return to Italy and was interrogated by the Venetian Inquisition, largely about the religiosity and lifestyle in England and of those around him. It's strongly suggested in some documentation that after the Italian boy left, De Vere made no returns to his wife, but was generally in the company of children, i.e., teenage boys and pages. Um, there's also some accusations of sedition, rumors of sedition. His Italian lover boy made no indications that De Vere was a Catholic, but did suggest that De Vere had a kind of live and let live mentality around religion. The French ambassador, however, said this in 1581. Let me just find this spot in the bio. I'm kind of jumping around a little bit. But I hope you're getting a picture of kind of what this guy is like.
I'm having a
Um,
rollicking good time, and
good,
you know,
good.
I had thought that the Oxfordian position was more politically motivated, and now I see it's anchored in reality. And
Seems to
yeah,
be. Yeah,
hmm
yeah,
I mean, and it's too much too to think about. It's like the moon landing, right? When if you
yeah.
dig, you start to like so much. is downstream from the idea that Shakespeare was a commoner from Stratford who invented the human. And
Right.
it, like, so much in our language and our world is predicated on this idea. And but once you think about it, you're like, well, wait, wouldn't we have more biography of this guy? Is it like,
And it's not like nobody has tried.
right.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be a case of, and is it a case where, like, maybe he was known in his day, but maybe not as well appreciated in his day? Is that kind of what we're meant
Mhm.
to believe? Like, I have a hard
Yeah.
time thinking that you would drop Hamlet, Macbeth, Lear,
Mhm.
all these great plays on people's heads, and you're like, you wouldn't be corresponding with people constantly. You wouldn't have like,
Right.
and he's not Thomas Pynchon.
Mhm.
He's not writing 5 novels and then disappearing. He's not J.D.
Right.
Salinger. He's
Right.
literally in the heart of the capital of the world,
Right.
London.
Right. Right.
So
Right. Right. Right.
yeah, you're right. I'm
Yeah.
totally DeVere pilled.
Yeah, yeah, it's bizarre. And people have to recall when you went to see one of these when you went to see a Shakespeare play, it wasn't like you talked to your friends like and said, "Oh, we're going to go see a Shakespeare play." It wasn't like it said Hamlet by William Shakespeare above the entrance. You were going to see a play. You were going to go see the Lord Chamberlain's Men perform a play. Oh, what do they got tonight? Hamlet. Okay, great. That sounds awesome. And you didn't walk out going, "Wow, that Shakespeare really wrote a." That's not how it was presented to you. That's
Right.
how
It
it's
was
presented to
probably
us
more about
now.
the company and
Hmm.
the
And
locale, and
right.
maybe the cult of the playwright hadn't quite taken off. I mean, you would have
Yeah.
probably known, but maybe,
Yeah, I
well, I don't
think
know. Yeah.
yeah, it's tricky to extract how it's not like there's a lot of surviving playbills or anything either. The documentation, that kind of thing is fairly murky, even more generally. So yeah, yeah. Um, Now talking about this sort of a little bit on the sedition thing, the French ambassador was pretty convinced that De Vere had Catholic leanings, but other people weren't so clear on it. But there is this one little thing I wanted to read. Um, yeah, here it is. In a letter from Mauvassier, who was the French ambassador, to the French king on 23rd of September, I think this is 1581, concerning the quote 5 ships which have been offered to me and are offered daily on behalf of a Jean de Seigneur, whom I have previously named, some nobleman who he's not saying the name of. Both the selected encoding and the suppression of the proper name underline the secrecy of the offer. Also on 23rd of September, the king wrote from Poitiers concerning, quote, English vessels commanded and led by Milord d'Angleterre. Oxford seems indeed to have agreed that he and his associates would lead a revolt of the Catholic party on the condition that they would receive support from France. So it's very possible that in the early 1580s, Oxford was conspiring with the French to overthrow Queen Elizabeth and reinstate Catholicism in England. It's very possible. It's not 100% sure. Um, uh, there is generally good documentation that De Vere was up to something. Probably the best instance is in 1581. There was an issue about De Vere refusing entry into his manor for the saltpeter inspector. So apparently the Queen had a saltpeter inspector. Saltpeter, for people who don't know, was used to make gunpowder. And so the Queen had a mandate that if she suspected you were hoarding materials to make gunpowder, that she could come and take a look. And De Vere would not allow this to happen at his estate. Um, and and apparently the reason that they did this inspection is that De Vere got drunk and was saying some seditious things. The saltpeter inspector was, "Hey, I got to take a look at your house," and Oxford's men either beat him up or were just sort of sent to intimidate him. They were referred to at times as De Vere's cutters. They just had a gang of henchmen and goons. Yeah. It's kind of wild, right? Now, now again on finances, we're going to talk a little bit more about finances now, which is generally boring, and we could go into a lot of details, but I'm going to try to broad stroke it here. So, in the late 1580s, De Vere would participate in the Accession Day tilts. Accession Day is the anniversary of the day whoever's on the throne, the day that they got on the throne, in the Elizabethan era, these turned into pretty wild festive parties, right? They include tournaments, joust, carnival stuff. They sound like it'd be kind of a good time, honestly. I'm sure everybody was pretty loaded. Um, and let me just read you. This is just from Wikipedia, but it gives you a sense of what was going on during the Accession Day tilts. Uh, Quote, knights participating in the spectacle entered in pageant cars or on horseback, disguised as some heroic, romantic, or metaphorical figure, with their servants in fancy dress according to the theme of the entry. A squire presented a pasteboard pageant shield decorated with the character's device to the queen and explained the significance of his disguise in prose or poetry. We have a surviving one of these for De Vere, actually. It's pretty fun. Entrants went to considerable expense to devise themes, order armor, and costumes for their followers, and in some cases to hire poets or dramatists and even professional actors to carry out their programs. Classical, pastoral, and Arthurian settings were typically combined with storylines flattering to the queen, but serious subtexts were also common. Okay. We know De Vere participated in these partially because, well, we have a surviving one of his sort of poems, presentational poems, which was, we'll talk about it in a little bit when it comes up more in the story. But we know he participated in these partially because he hired a tailor to create elaborate outfits and never paid him. The tailor ended up suing him years later, and a big blow up that exposed a whole bunch of people that De Vere had not paid. So he gets sued by one guy, and then everybody else start coming out of the woodwork. It's just like now when Harvey Weinstein gets, outed, and all these women start coming out. It's kind of like that, except De Vere wasn't paying anybody anything. Where was all the money going, right? Well, lots of places, but some of the worst money that De Vere ever spent was trying to find the Northwest Passage. This was a craze at the time. People might be familiar with. Yeah. At the time, the American continent was not very well understood, and the assumption was that there was some way through the St. Lawrence Seaway and possibly the Great Lakes and through Canada, there was some way that you could get to the Pacific Ocean over there. And this trying to find this went on for years, decades. So it wasn't stupid to spend money on it, but De Vere lost a lot of money trying to accomplish this. And this was just a craze. It was a European craze at the time, and people thought that they were going to make their fortunes. In 1577, De Vere sinks at least 5,000 pounds in, even basically drawing up bonds, basically taking a loan to then invest the money into this Northwest Passage expedition. Oxford apparently suspected that he was getting defrauded in all of this. This was the $3,000 in Venice deal. And it appears that he sent a gang of men to intimidate the man that he owed money, which, of course, he's getting defrauded on an investment. What does he do? He sends a bunch of goons to go intimidate the guy, and the debt is, sort of forgiven. Later, De Vere invests another 500 pounds in a different expedition. I think there were a total of 4 expeditions he'd invested money in. The last one was with Adrian Gilbert, the famous Walter Raleigh, and the famous John Dee, who we may have talked about before. John Dee was having these visionary experiences and drawing up maps of the Northwest Passage, and it just wasn't real. It just
I love it. That's great.
Passage.
Yeah, but it's still magic, dude, because it's creating random chaos, adding chaos to the mix.
Right.
Yeah,
right,
sending
right.
people, sending men to their deaths. The house wizard to Elizabeth says that it's this way, and they go off and die, and then let's go. Yeah. Chaos into the mix.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
John Dee, baby, let's go. We got to do him at some point, dude. That might be a Patreon
cool.
only. That'd be do like a 90-minute, quick hit on John Dee.
Yeah,
that would be cool.
That could be
he invented
cool.
the phrase "the British Empire."
Did he really?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, that's an NLP right there. That is magic.
NLP. There you are.
Yeah. That is magic.
Yeah,
absolutely.
It is. That's the definition of magic. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Now, De Vere's finances, as we've said, terrible. Now, between 1575, the year before he went to Italy, when he was 25, and 1599, his worth went from about 12,000 pounds a year. That's what we thought we were taking. So what's 12 times 300,000? Well, 12,000. Yeah, 12 times 300,000. Kevin, can you do that math real quick?
It's 3.6 million.
Okay, so what his land was bringing to him, very roughly in today's money, would have been about $3.6 million a year.
That's crazy.
Right?
I could
That's
live
about
off that. I could live off
yeah.
that.
I could eke by. Yeah.
Yeah.
he had he had 77 landed inheritances. Um, uh, by 1599, he had nothing. He had virtually nothing. He was selling the stones and timbers of of the remaining castles, and he would do everything to try and squeeze money of this. Uh, he would make these bizarre business arrangements with people. He would like loan them the land. He would set up strange things where like you bought the land from him, but you couldn't live on it until something else happened. Like he had all of these very sort of complicated, basically just scams he was running on people to make as much money as he possibly could off of the land. Um, he would at one point, Lord Burleigh gives him a piece of property as a wedding present, and De Vere had been pissed off that he couldn't simply sell it, so he gave it back to Burleigh in exchange for £3,000. So Lord Burleigh says, "Hey, for your wedding present, here's this piece of land." De Vere's like, "I want money, dude. What are you talking about?" Right? De Vere, so he gives the piece of land back to Lord Burleigh. Lord Burleigh gives him £3,000, right? Quite a lot of money. What does De Vere do before he gives it over? He sells as many rocks and trees off of it as he possibly can, and then says, "Here, take it back. I don't want this."
Like stripping it for parts, like what they're doing to
Yeah.
the United States right now.
Right.
Yeah, just fuck it.
Just just blowing it. By
Dude, the state
1590,
of commercial real estate here is like across the country is insane. There are
yeah,
buildings that are selling in like downtown Minneapolis where I'm like, oh man, if I had done a little better in crypto, you're
yeah,
going like where it was like it sold for like 20 million, now it's selling for 4.5.
right.
And you
Yeah,
go,
you can
and
buy
you
like a
realize,
Walmart square footage. Yeah,
right, and when you
yeah,
realize like, no, I'm talking about like buildings in downtown Minneapolis,
right,
like commercial,
right.
like office buildings,
Yeah,
and it again, this is another case of how they've democratized everything, where like the person losing money, it's like the plumbers union in Iowa
yeah.
it has some
That's who's losing
fund,
out. Their
they're losing
pension
the
is dependent
right,
on
like
it
it's getting
somehow. Yeah,
hit and it's all
yeah,
abstracted and fractalized. It's not like one guy bought that building, it's a
no,
fund and they've got management and oh my God, what a disaster, what a
right,
mess.
right,
You know,
right. It really is.
yeah,
Yeah,
listen,
yeah,
everybody. Hold the line, work from home, work remotely, get your email job, hold the line, refuse to go back in, hold the
yeah,
line. We can win forever.
yeah.
We can take our lives back. For real. I'm an optimist, dude. The AI is going to make
Man,
work easier. They're still going to need hired hands to like interact with the AI. We're going to be fine, but don't refuse to go to work in an office. That's all I'm saying.
yeah, yeah.
That's my
Yeah, it's like
politics.
work from home or like work out in the field or something, but don't do the
Something. Just
office
do
thing.
anything. And if you're a
Jeez.
young person, do
Yeah.
anything you can to avoid having to go in. You might have to do it for a few years. You
Yeah.
might have to do
Yeah.
a hybrid thing for a few years, get the experience. But then I'm telling
Yeah.
you, your kill shot is repeat after me: LinkedIn, remote, easy apply. Okay. And
Yeah.
if you're a money person, you've got money, hire people remotely because the
Mm-hmm.
work's going to get done. I promise you. I promise you. And if it doesn't, you just fire them. Okay. But
Mm-hmm.
just you don't need the
Stab him in the
overhead.
leg with a
You
foil.
stab them in there you go.
um, so by 1592, De Vere has nothing, basically. He's given up basically all of his property. The very roof he died in, the only reason he had that is because his second wife's family hung on to it, right? So you got a guy who's making $3.6 million a year, dies in his like wife's in a little building on his wife's parents' property, right? Um, Wild. Now,
What a
um,
goon.
yeah, yeah, for real. Now, another defining characteristic of sort of the back half of De Vere's life is a constant attempt to navigate the court with his terrible financial decisions and his total self-aggrandizing behavior. Right? He can't handle anyone being above him, and very few people are. Right? I mean, it's the Queen, it's Lord, that's about it, really. But he can't handle conforming to what he's supposed to do. Alan Nelson, sort of the guy who wrote this Monstrous Adversary book, he sort of tracks the rise and fall of De Vere's reputation among the nobility with the annual vote count that he receives for the Order of the Garter. And the Order of the Garter is a chivalric order dedicated to St. George, the Saint of England, right? Or would it be, is it the Saint of Great Britain? Would he be?
Which is England. George is England. They have different.
Okay.
It's St. Andrew for Scotland. Yeah. Pretty sure.
Okay.
And I don't know the Welsh one. I'm going to look it up.
Yeah, no, it's okay. So this was the highest order of knights you could be, and it was voted on by 12 members, and the Queen gave final say so. So despite occasional majority, go ahead.
St. David for the Welsh.
Oh, okay. All right. So De Vere never gets into the Order of the Garter, and his vote count like goes up and down, and this is how you can measure his sort of virtue, but or his, not his virtue, but his sort of ranking within the tacit ranking within the nobility. He's often in the back half of his life he's making constant attempts at getting something out of the monarchy too, and it seems like this is his idea of work. He for a long time he's fighting to obtain magisterial control over the import of fruits and wools, which could have been cover for smuggling operations to the continent. It's possible. It's never given to him. In the 1590s, the Count Danvers is taken up on treason charges, and De Vere petitions to be given the man's land. He's always just like asking if he can have something, and then being really pissed off that it's not just given to him. Like, why? I should be in charge of the wool. Why? I should be though.
Lord,
there's no argument.
Give me a fraction of the confidence of this fail son. Right. But he wrote Hamlet, so I don't know.
Right.
This is such a turn for me. I did not expect to go all in, but I'm 100% an Oxfordian now. I'm going to go tweet it right now.
You're more of an Oxfordian than I am, man.
Listen, you know what? I know what it takes to write a play, and I don't think that a dude from the middle of nowhere wrote 29 of them, including Mackers. I'm having a hard time. 39, excuse me.
Yeah.
I don't, and I think it might have been multiple dudes. I think it might have been. I think it might have been a collaboration, like a collective.
We're going to talk a little bit about that in the After Dark.
Yeah, that's what I think. And I think there are lots of reasons that it's too perfect that one commoner crafted this, and it's just this like total outlier. Yeah. I call bullshit.
Yeah, it's a myth. I mean,
it's a myth.
The deeper you get into it, the more it feels like a myth too. It's just like, yeah. So, another thing he does, he spends a bunch of time. Something like a third of all of his letters are petitioning various people to give him control of the tin mines. He really wants to be in charge of the tin mines, and he promises the Queen that he'll like increase her revenues from the tin mines by like 30%, and nobody ever takes him seriously. I mean, imagine you have a guy who's just running this empire into the ground behind him, and he's writing you a letter saying, why don't you let me control one of the nation's most important natural resources? We're like, what are you talking about?
He's kind of giving Jeffrey Epstein a little bit, isn't he? He's kind of giving, who is this guy?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Wild. So
don't like it.
Yeah. So I should add at this point too, and I'm kind of running through this, but we're getting there. In the 1580s, he does reconcile with his wife, and they end up having 3 daughters in total. This is largely on pressure from Lord Burleigh to get an heir. They want an heir, right? Obviously, that's because if you don't have a male heir and you're in the nobility, at that time it caused all kinds of complications, right? But despite quote unquote reconciliation, there is sort of documented complaints from various people that De Vere treated his wife horribly. Like, she'd be 8 months pregnant and he's screaming at her, right? This like just terrible temperament towards her. Yeah. Now, his reputation in the 1580s and 90s among the nobility is slipping, partially from the reasons we've stated, mostly this financial stuff. Now, is at the same time he's writing plays that are nationalistic psyops for the Queen? that is possible. At some point, 1586, she starts giving him £1,000 a year. Nobody can really explain. Nobody has a very convincing explanation. When I read that, they say the queen says, "We're going to give him £1,000 a year just so he maintains his nobility." I think, why didn't they just kill him? Why wouldn't you just kill him? Like all this other stuff that they do, I don't understand why you would keep him around. If you're just he's an embarrassment to the nobility, just
Could have
it's not
been
that
the
hard to kill him.
affair. Maybe he had, I don't know. Yeah.
Right.
Or he was the greatest writer of all time.
Right.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. It's tricky. Um yeah. uh yeah. Okay. Um there is one thing to, and it's just like I could keep going with this, making the case for him being okay, making the case for him being Shakespeare. Okay, let's talk about the Hamlet play briefly. There's uh, Oxford had a somewhat famous falling out at tennis with a man named Philip Sidney. Now, there's a line in Hamlet spoken by Polonius that goes something like this: or then, with such or such, and as you say, there was he gaming, there or took an inn's rouse, there falling out at tennis, or perchance I saw him enter such a house of sale, vid elect a brothel, or so forth. This is, if Polonius is Lord Burleigh, this would be Lord Burleigh talking about Hamlet, and Hamlet would be Edward de Vere, right? Um, but this falling out at tennis, this actually happened with de Vere and a man named Philip Sidney. Sidney was technically outranked by Oxford, but he was a man of very solid reputation and a real contributor to the Elizabethan Renaissance in his own right. He might even be remembered more than de Vere as such if de Vere was not suspected to be Shakespeare, right? If we didn't think that de Vere was Shakespeare, we would remember Philip Sidney more than de Vere. He had been promised to be de Vere's wife, Anne, when he was 15 and she was 12. That didn't happen. Apparently, sometime in the 1580s, de Vere asked to play tennis with Sidney and the fellas, and Sidney rejected him because de Vere was an embarrassment, right? And if he's a violent thug, it's like Tony Soprano's like, "Hey, can I play tennis with you?" And you're like, "Man, dude, no, I don't want to play tennis with you, man. I don't want anything to do with you, man." Like, and then it's also like, "Oh yeah, he runs the mob." Shit, like I shouldn't have done that, right? De Vere calls him a puppy, and then there were movements like they were actually going to have a duel. When people got in the way of this, according to a man who knew Oxford well, Oxford plotted to have Sidney murdered. He was trying to arrange his henchmen to go murder Philip Sidney. And the Sidneys, we're going to talk more about the Sidney family in the After Dark because his sister, Philip Sidney's sister, is one of the leading other candidates for the identity of Shakespeare. Mary Sidney, this is the Countess of Pembroke theory. But the Sidneys were like the Medicis of the English Renaissance. Killing Philip Sidney is like killing the son of the Medicis. It's like it'd be a wild thing to do, even though technically he ranked below Oxford in the noble ranks, right? So eventually, this grudge blows out past Philip Sidney into a guy named well, how would you say this? Leicester. Leicester?
It's Leicester.
Lester. See, I would have got that so wrong.
Yeah,
oh, man.
yeah,
they just got letters in there they just don't even use.
You got to
You know?
spend 3 months in London and
Yeah,
you'll be all right. Then you kind of get it. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, okay, this Leicester, this is Sidney's uncle, Philip
Leicester.
Sidney's uncle.
Lester.
Lester?
Lester.
Lester.
Yeah.
Listerine? Lester. Lester. Okay. I didn't think I couldn't pronounce English. I thought I was decent on English.
It doesn't look like Leicester. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It doesn't. It's got 3 extra letters in it. Anyway, Leicester. Yeah. Okay. Leicester is a nobleman who's already in trouble with the queen because he had an unauthorized wedding, right? And there were reports that Oxford tried to poison Leicester and that he had also plotted a physical attack. This grudge heated up so much that the queen or the Privy Council confined Oxford to house arrest in 1579. Now, under house arrest, Oxford, who never wanted to be told what to do, started losing his mind. Visitors claimed that he did nothing but rail against his former associates in the upper class, such as Henry Howard and Charles Arundel. He railed against Leicester and the Queen. He was apparently wasted all of the time. Like just would get drunk and lie and make up wild stories about the past, about how like various countesses in Italy had traveled to sleep with him. He said that St. Mark's Church in Venice was paved with diamonds and rubies. He said that he'd been a preacher in Strasbourg for some amount of time. He said that he could have been governor of Milan in Italy if the Queen had forced him to return. All just total BS. So you have to imagine him, De Vere, he's 30 years old, under house arrest, wasted, and just lying and aggrandizing himself as his empire just crumbles behind him, right? And why is he under house arrest? Because he's in a feud with some guys that wouldn't let him play tennis with them, right? Just maniac, weird, like
sounds a little like Hamlet
stuff.
Sounds a little bit like Hamlet.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, how do you write crazy? I mean, maybe you know what it's like to have. Yeah. Crazy.
Yeah. Yeah. He was also when he was under house arrest, because people would come visit him, he was saying very seditious things around the table. He was calling English Catholics cowards because they wouldn't rebel against the Queen. That's a pretty bold thing to say. He's also saying that he had actually slept with the Queen. He also was apparently compiling a book of prophecies, which we kind of referred to earlier, which became a focal point of a later trial. The De Vere, well, let's talk about this right now. So 1579, there was some suspicion that Oxford De Vere was involved in a anti-Elizabethan plot, despite all of these things she'd done with him, all the ways she'd forgiven him, right? Or that he was making some kind of pro-Catholic move. The heat was increasing, and in short, Oxford realizes that he's got to do something. What does he do? He denounces his former associates, Charles Arundel, famous Catholic recusant, who would later become a leader among English exiles in France, and Charles Arundel's cousin, Henry Howard. Basically, Oxford decides that if he snitches on them and begs the Queen for forgiveness, he might be okay. That's the official story. Let me read this little bit. Yeah. Quote, on a Friday before Christmas 1580, apparently on December 16th, in the President's chamber at Greenwich, Oxford publicly accused his three erstwhile friends of sedition, indeed of treason. Oxford named Henry Howard as the most villainous person on earth, and the entire Howard clan as the worst noble family on earth. Throwing himself on his knees before the Queen, he confessed to a pro-Catholic conspiracy over the past 4 years involving himself, Howard, Charles Arundel, and Francis Southwell. More particularly, he accused Howard of having reconciled to Rome through the offices of the mass priest Stevens, and he confessed that he himself had spirited Stevens out of the country with the help of the French ambassador to whom he appealed as a witness. Okay. This leads to a lot of accusations coming back on Edward de Vere. It's one of these things where, like, you make an accusation, and then the people are like, dude, do you have any idea what you've been up to these last few years? Like, you can say that, but, like, you're a monster, dude. Like, and we're gonna get you now. We're gonna do our best to get you. All these accusations come out, and you could say that they're just trying to defend themselves, but you'd think that some of their defense would be more about defending themselves instead of just attacking this guy. Like, they don't really, it doesn't seem like they're ever saying we didn't do this. We're saying, like, this guy is a terrible human being. They accuse him of atheism, which was very dangerous to be an atheist at that time. For instance, Walter Raleigh, the nobleman explorer, had to defend himself against charges of atheism. Thomas Kidd, the playwright and one-time roommate of Christopher Marlowe, was imprisoned and tortured because he was an atheist, and tortured for more information about who'd given him these pamphlets or books. They also accused Charles Arundel and Henry Howard accused De Vere of being involved with the Spanish ambassador, and this was not a time to be involved with the Spanish. The Spanish Armada, which was a big deal, happened in 1588. We're going to talk about that in a minute.
All of history could have gone a different direction if it hadn't been for John Dee summoning the storm that sank the Spanish Armada.
Something like that. Yeah, it's wild. Something like that. It is. We're going to talk about it in a minute. There is like a moment you're reading it like, why did the Spanish do this? Like, it was like a it's just a terrible plan. It's a very strange moment, actually, but we're going to talk about it in a minute because De Vere is somewhat involved. Um, let's see. They accused Oxford of sodomy, of course, and let me read about that part. This is Art of Darkness, after all. Um,
Sodomy is definitely our
sodomy.
beat. It's been our
Yeah.
beat since the Wild episode. Actually,
Yeah.
since episode 1 with Burroughs.
Yeah. That's true. Yeah, it's been there all along. Quote, at the same time as they were accusing Oxford of all possible sins, Howard and Arundel were bent on having Oxford tried for the specific crime of pederasty. To this end, they offered testimony from nearly a dozen victims, near victims, and non-victim witnesses. They charged Oxford with the sexual abuse of so many boys that it must needs come out, especially of pages. Names are supplied along with specific times and places. Ralph Hopton, Italian boy Orazio, who complained how horribly my lord had abused him, Tom Cook, Power the Cook at Hampton Court, and there's just a bunch of other names, right? There was also, like I said, confusing claims about a scandalous and blasphemous book of prophecies that Oxford had assembled during his house arrest. Let me just read a quick thing on that as well, just because this is the salacious stuff, right? Quote, contemporary evidence supports claims of Howard Arundel and Southwell that Oxford was more than ordinarily superstitious. A river of books and pamphlets that issued from the London presses in the immediate aftermath of the 1580 earthquake were largely the work of Oxford's servants and proteges. The only two people killed as a direct result of the tremor, Thomas Gray and Mabel Everett, were both sitting piously in the church at Christ Hospital when the stones from the ceiling fell upon them. Oxford's proteges nevertheless read the quake as a warning not against church-going, but against play-going, bear-baiting, cross-dressing, and other social sins. So it's a little confusing. One thing I do want to say, this book, people... Oxfordians and Stratfordians are both guilty of this, and maybe everybody is always guilty of this. People tend to fall into the biases of their side of the argument. I think that Alan Nelson is perhaps somewhat biased in favoring the Charles Arundel and Henry Howard accusations but one has to keep in mind that they were trying to keep their own butts out of prison for treason. So are they telling the truth? Are they not? I mean, the one thing in support of Charles Arundel and Henry Howard is that De Vere had a reputation for a lot of this stuff before this trial ever happened. So it could be that they were playing it up, right? But I just want to put that caveat. We're not, just because some guy says you're a pederast doesn't mean you are, I guess is my point. But there's other supporting evidence in the case of De Vere. Right. So in sum, Arundel charged De Vere with atheism, pathological lying, subordination, murder by hire, sedition, sexual perversion, pederasty, drunkenness, and nursing private grudges. That was the litany of accusations against De Vere in this 1580 thing. What was the outcome of this sort of trial, whatever you want to call it? The outcome was that Charles Arundel would be effectively imprisoned in the Tower of London until 1583, after which he fled to Paris with one of the leaders of the Throckmorton plot, one of the many plots to dethrone Queen Elizabeth and replace her with Mary, Queen of the Scots, attempts to make the country Catholic again. Henry Howard was imprisoned for a time and then released, and then later imprisoned during the Throckmorton plot. No signs that Oxford was involved in the Throckmorton plot. Oxford, too, would spend further time under house arrest following this in early 1581, time that seems to have simply compounded his resentment for the monarchy. You do have to wonder, how did he get away with all of these charges? He gets the house arrest for a little while. Is that just because he's nobility? Is it because he's important in some other way? I mean, I think that's a reasonable question. We're not talking about, we think now that rich people get off legally, right? At that time, it was even more than that. He wasn't even rich anymore, really. He was sort of rich in titles, I guess, but didn't really have any money. Okay. In 1580, not long after this whole thing with Charles Arundel and Henry Howard, turns out that Oxford had a mistress. She was 19-year-old Yorkshire girl Anne Vavasor. He had impregnated her through he impregnated her the first time. This ended in miscarriage. Then he has a second child, which would be carried to term. Basically, anyone who said anything about this relationship, Oxford would threaten with death. The second child was born March of 1581, and Oxford again flees the country. He has a kid come out and he's like, "Well, I'm out of here." But they quickly the queen sends her men. They quickly capture him and they put him in the Tower of London for a little while. This boy, baptized Edward de Vere, would be completely estranged from Oxford, who would have nothing to do with him and never wrote any on paper, never said a word about him. Okay. Out of prison. 1581, De Vere is out of imprisonment, and he basically gets Lord Burleigh to get him back in the good graces of the Queen, right? It's been a tough few years here. He's had house arrest. He's been in the Tower of London. He's been in prison for having all of these accusations from Charles Arundel and Henry Howard. What he ultimately gets arrested for and put in prison is because he had a child out of wedlock. Just interesting. I guess that thing certainly did happen. So
I mean, yeah. I mean, we talked about that on my episode about how seriously they took all of that business. I mean, and it's a reasonable thing to take seriously. It's no small thing to bring life into the world. And if you're going to you're adding more problems for the state if you're like creating bastard children that have no, what do we do with them? Like, it's a mess. Where does the money go? Creates all kinds of downstream problems,
Right. Yeah, it definitely does.
Now the state just picks up the tab. Now.
Yeah. Right.
And I mean, here we are. It's an interesting problem. Yeah. Very tricky.
Yeah. It's certainly the way isn't to have no rules about it or no conventions about it, right? It should have something in place, it seems. So let's see. In 1581, this is weird.
Hard to overstate how much heavy lifting shame did before 1969.
Remember
Shame? Shame did a lot. And it's very interesting how much people all through my childhood, the feeling of shame was very deeply resented by people. People really no shame, and never feel any shame. I'm pro shame. There's room for some shame.
I think if you do something shameworthy, you should be ashamed of yourself.
Yeah, shameful.
And that doesn't mean you should be like locked away and thrown away, locked up and thrown away the key, but you should have that feeling of like, man,
you really should be capable of feeling shame.
Yeah. Right.
We should have an entire month devoted to shame. What's the opposite month of June?
Well, how's
because June, of course,
opposite. Do you think winter, like January?
Yeah. Let's make January on Art of Darkness because of course June, the month of June is consecrated to the Sacred Heart of Jesus.
Right.
No, it's the Sacred Heart of on Art of Darkness. But so we need a month that's devoted to shame. We need a shame flag. We need a shame. What is a flag?
I don't know what that looks like.
Shame flag? No, it's just a gray flag.
It's just a gray flag.
It's just a gray flag with maybe like a cloud on it.
Everybody could have a slightly different one because it's like your mistake is on there. Whatever.
What we need though is but we need the starter shame flag. Right. And if somebody's feeling motivated, one of our listeners is feeling motivated to design a shame flag, I want you to please do that for Art of Darkness. And then what would really be fun is that every January we can start adding more filigree and more like nonsense to the shame flag.
Yeah.
That evolves over time. I like that idea a lot. I really seriously email us at artofdarkpod@gmail.com or get into the Telegram if you have a design for the shame flag. So January, February, March, April, May, June. Yeah, January is now the month of shame.
Yeah, I like it. Yeah,
we celebrate Shame Month on Art of Darkness.
And in the Northern Hemisphere, that's a good month to just.
That's a great month of shame. Yeah. It already kind of is. Like everybody has new resolutions and da da da. But we're formalizing it.
Yeah, people are trying to. What would that like
better themselves?
Or like better themselves.
No, but we're really gonna.
Yeah, but then also if like the weather sucks, you go outside and the weather sucks. It's kind of like, well, I could kind of deserve this. Yeah,
Right.
like
You
I
do.
deserve it to be kind of crappy out.
For
Yeah,
your original sin, if not for
right.
anything else. I want to, but really, we got to remember this come January because I want to be clear too. We celebrate Shame Month.
Mm.
You
Yeah,
got to
yeah, yeah, yeah,
celebrate your shame.
yeah,
You
yeah.
have because it's part of being human.
But it doesn't mean you don't feel it.
Right. I
Yeah,
feel like
yeah,
we this was a really serious breakthrough we just had on the
yeah.
pod.
That's pretty. I think. I
I
mean,
think Shame
yeah.
Month is really good.
I think if somebody if you tweet out something about the shame flag and the flag is
Hmm.
like really resonant, designed in a manner that really clicks, that's a 10 million tweet right there.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
I just put in the telegram. January is Shame
Yeah.
Month now. We need a Shame Month flag. Please send designs. Go on.
I love it. Yeah. Yeah, 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 I love it. There's a couple of things DeVere does that are only lightly documented, and so we can only speculate about why he did this. In 1581, he sues to gain the guardianship of a 4-year-old boy named Henry Bullock. It seems that he did this in order to gain access to properties the boy was set to inherit, but I, I don't really nobody really knows what the deal was here. You if you had somebody was your ward, they basically had to pay you back. They were in your debt. So he may have been trying to take on an indentured servitude. The dark interpretation is he thought this 4-year-old boy was attractive and he just wanted him to be in his fold. That's the dark interpretation. Not documented that that's what happened, but for a guy who kept tumbling boys, it's hard to know where his limits were, right? Um, to further in the 1580s, to further gain the Queen's esteem, he joined a number of tournaments and won them. He just apparently was really good at like jousting and fighting and all of the things that went along with the tournaments. He was horse riding, all of that stuff. He was apparently very good at. Um, and yet, despite in the 1580s, him knowing that he had to get back into the tournaments or get back into the Queen's favor, he showed no signs of easing up on his general brutality. In March of 1582, there's a fight between Oxford and his men on one side and a man named Thomas Knivet, the brother of a man Oxford swore to kill in 1580. In this fight between these two gangs of henchmen, one of Oxford's men was killed, and De Vere himself was injured. The fight continued, broke out again a couple months later. There were henchmen fighting with boat hooks in the street. Like this could be a movie. Just like De Vere as gangster could be a movie. Forget the whether he wrote the plays or not, right? There's a total brawl apparently between Oxford's men. Another time there was a total brawl between Oxford's men and Knivet's men. Knivet's men outnumbered him. There was a third fight on Fleet Street when another of Oxford's men dies at the hand of Knivet. It's also possible that another one of Oxford's men he lost at least 2 men, maybe 3 or 4 men in this grudge. Just straight up violence in the streets, right? Probably sword fights at times. I don't really know. It's not really documented what happened. It's just like there was a fight. Um, Burleigh continues, despite this, to try and defend Oxford in the public square. And I just want to read his plea really quick that he makes. I think this is to the Queen. It might be to somebody else. Lord Burleigh, remember, is always like trying to figure out a way to defend Edward de Vere, almost no matter what he does. It's kind of bizarre, frankly. Um, let's see. Is that what I want for this? Let's see. Quote, as this isn't a letter from Burleigh. This is another bit, but it summarizes this period I'm talking about. Quote, as we anticipate Oxford's return to the Queen's favor and so to court, we may take a parting glance at the havoc wreaked by his year-long quarrel with Thomas Knivet. Oxford's man Garrett was killed, perhaps by Knivet himself. Knivet and Oxford were both wounded, Oxford more seriously. Oxford's man Gastrel was hurt by one of Knivet's men, while Oxford's man Harvey was wounded accidentally by Gastrel. Oxford's man Gastrel killed Long Tom, who served Knivet but had once served Oxford, a bad fellow to serve any honest man. Roper of the Guards challenged Gastrel, as did Costock. Oxford was slain, and Oxford complained to Hatton of both Roper and Hall. Oxford's man Robert Brennings was slain in undisclosed circumstances. The principal challenges seem to have come, logically enough, from Knivet's side, and yet it must be informed that my lord of Oxford's men do offer these frays. Right? So Oxford's men were just like, Oxford doesn't like that guy. We're going to get him. We're gonna try and murder him in the street. Like it's full
Cool.
on
That's a
gangster
cool way to
stuff.
live. I love it. Yeah, I love that. That rocks.
Yeah. Now, we're gonna skip ahead a couple years here. 1587, Mary, Queen of the Scots, is finally executed, and Oxford. Remember, Mary, Queen of the Scots. She's got a rival claim to the throne. She's the Catholic side. Elizabeth, she's on the throne. She's cousins, or I think half sister. I think half sister with Mary, Queen of the Scots. I'm getting my royal lineage all scrambled up in the
You're
old
getting your
brain here.
mafia family tree all messed up. That's all they are. They're just a mob.
They are.
That's all it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
They have a monopoly of the state. They are the state. They have a monopoly on force. They're a mob. That's it.
Yeah,
That's
they are.
fine.
Yeah. Yeah.
God love
Well,
them.
they did it. They did it for a
Yeah,
while. I mean,
sure. I mean,
yeah.
nobody does it now though. It's
Right.
over now.
Exactly. Well, now
Yeah.
we got democracy.
Thank God
now.
the right people won.
Yeah.
Every
Yeah.
time.
Uh, okay, so Mary Queen of the Scots is executed. Oxford lines up at the trough, like every other nobleman, just to see if he can get his hands in some of the property. Now, for this is what would happen too. It's like you have to imagine too, like if a noble person of some kind loses their reputation, treason, whatever, they get executed, their land goes up, and then it can just be given to anybody. So imagine, are you incentivized to give another nobleman a fair shot and say, I wonder if they really did that, or do you just go, oh, maybe I can get 100 acres of his sheep land to kill him, hang him, I don't care, very kind of strange. Now, in 1587. His wife is once again pregnant with their fourth daughter and the final child they have together. He's still totally inhumane to where he's browbeating her on a daily basis. He chastises Burleigh during this time for not getting him the land he wants after Mary, Queen of the Scots, is killed. At this point, 1587, he's rapidly approaching total pennilessness. If it weren't for that 1,000 pound annuity, that's pretty much all he's got left. This fourth child would die in infancy, and a few months later, Oxford's first wife would die. Oxford would not attend either funeral. Now, the Spanish Armada happens in 1588. For people who don't know, I wanted to go full war guy on this, but it seems like
no,
the Spanish...
never go full war guy. That's probably the only thing that would destroy our friendship. Is if you became a war guy.
War guy.
Oh God, I hate the war guys, dude.
So
they know everything.
Right. It's wild. Yeah. I don't have that. My brain doesn't work that way.
I guess we're art guys. We're art guys.
This is this kind of show is as close to I can get to knowing everything.
To being
Focus
a guy.
on it for 5 weeks, 6 weeks maybe, and then I can't pay attention to it anymore. Spanish Armada. So general thrust, the Spanish Catholic, they're going to send some forces to England, trying to get Queen Elizabeth off the throne, right? They send 24 of their big old Spanish galleons up the English Channel to try and meet up with the armed invasion force. The English caught wind of this, possibly because Queen Elizabeth's very sophisticated intelligence network, which she did. She had a lot of people out there putting feelers out there. And you could also imagine if De Vere pro-Catholic, and was he going to the Low Countries and talking to French ambassadors because he was a Catholic, or was he doing it at the behest of Queen Elizabeth to get information? No one would know.
And getting that fat check, getting
paid for it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, was he a spy? Could be. Yeah, makes as much. I mean, I think.
Well, and if he was a spy, he would have been a spy master too. I mean, he would have been running the group for that amount of money. Yeah,
and he had a bunch of hoodlums that worked for him. Yeah,
he's got his own little. Yeah, he's like Mossad.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Whatever.
Right.
CIA of the time.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, these 24 Spanish warships met with the much more agile and more numerous 34 English warships, as well as countless armed merchant vessels. So the Spanish Armada comes sort of slowly drifting upstream, and every boat in England comes out to meet them. Right? It's like, what are you guys doing out? What's happening here? There were so anyway, There was some cool stuff here. There were night battles with English fire ships. The English Navy just basically outclassed the Spaniards, eventually chased them out into the North Sea. The Spanish lost thousands of men and dozens of boats. And what did Oxford do during this time? Let me read a couple bits. By the way, the winner of many tournaments could not be beaten in a joust, right? This guy seems like he might be kind of useful in a fray of some sort, right? Let me read a little bit about this. So, um, quote, this is from a modern, this is a more modern literary historical thesis given by Duff Hart Davis in 1988. Quote, a huge wave of patriotism had sent volunteers pouring into the ports along the south coast, many of them physically alerted by the thunder of the day's engagement, which had been audible for miles inland. Just as the Spanish noblemen now drifting helplessly up the channel had been drawn to join the Armada by dreams of loot and glory, so now young English bloods came flocking in as unto a set field, where immortal fame and glory was to be attained and faithful service performed unto their prince and country. Chief among them were the Earls of Oxford, Northumberland, and Cumberland. And he lists a bunch of people. Yeah. So this idea that Oxford leapt into battle, right? Then at the same, that's written in 1988, kind of looking back. Now, at the same time, contemporaneous with the Spanish Armada, slightly after, there was where did it go? There was a set of poems supposedly written by basically a Spaniard who had taken refuge in England and then wrote these poems. He'd sort of converted to the English cause in some way. Let's see if I can actually find this. And this is this is a description of the poems. Quote, the graphic description of the Earl of Oxford, quote, standing on the hatches with the bore on his helmet, foaming for inward ire, conveys the impression that the ballad was written by someone who actually saw Oxford standing in full armor on the deck of his ship. There could hardly have been a more likely eyewitness than John Lilly, Oxford's private secretary. Lilly always signed his name, in a weird spelling of John Lilly, whence no doubt the initials IL of the author of the ballad. Now, he was Oxford during the Spanish Armada. After the Spanish Armada, he was also lionized in a celebratory ballad performed at Thanksgiving service at St. Paul's Cathedral. This was a very big moment for England in defending itself against the Spaniards, right? And Oxford was right at the heart of this, according to some of the documentation. But the problem is that none of that about Oxford's actually true. That's just how it was written about. Oxford, it turns out that the poem written by the Spanish, the Spanish man seeking refuge, that was actually put in place by Lord Burleigh as a psyop, so that people on the continent would think that the entire English nobility was behind the Queen. It turned out that Oxford had shown up to possibly serve, and this is simplifying it, but basically he wanted to be a captain of a ship, and when it turned out that he couldn't be, he said, "Oh, screw you guys. I don't want anything to do with this," and he left. And so he didn't do anything. He didn't fight, he didn't do anything. But they needed the monarchy needed it to look like all of the nobility had like risen up in this they're all behind Queen Elizabeth. And so they pretended that he did in public. They pretended Oxford was a hero, one of the many heroes of the Spanish Armada. But behind the scenes, Lord Burleigh and the Queen, they knew the truth. And that was the end of De Vere's reputation. He never again got a vote for the Order of the Garter.
Correct.
Never again got favored by it for anything. And his life is, after 1588, in terms of his public reputation among the nobility, is just a steep decline. Okay. This section's final decade or so. We're getting there. So he did still have that annuity thing. That's one thing he's got going on. He's starting to figure out, trying to put properties into trust for his children. There's a few properties out there, but he's basically still doing weird business arrangements that don't really make any sense and are borderline scams. After his wife died, he does get married a second time to a woman named Elizabeth Trentham. She was attractive, older than his first wife by quite a bit, and much tougher than his first wife. There's a letter suggesting she was good with Oxford's young daughters, and perhaps was a force for reconciliation between Oxford and his daughters, but also that she could be kind of hard on the servants. Oxford has a son, Henry, with the second wife in 1592. Henry would become the 18th Earl of Oxford. And a couple years after this, Oxford's oldest daughter marries William Stanley, the sixth Earl of Derby. In 1597, Oxford moves to Hackney House, which is basically out in the country. This is the house that was actually owned by his second wife's family. And here, the physical infirmity that had been plaguing him, he would write about not having an able body and not being able to do these physical things. That had picked up in the mid 1580s and just mid to late 1580s and just got continually worse. Nobody really knows what it is. If it's from knife fights in the streets, if it's from jousts, he's fighting in these tournaments, he could have had some kind of injury. If it was syphilis, he talks about his lame hand. He had some ambiguous ailment that plagued him for the last 15 years or so of his life. 1598, Lord Burleigh, William Cecil, the guy who basically raised him and had raised Oxford's children too, and got him out of countless jams. Lord Burleigh dies. He leaves behind a sizable inheritance to Oxford's children, so they're basically set. It's kind of like that moment in Fargo where it's like they never have to. What does he say?
Yeah. Scotty and Jean never have to worry.
Yeah, Scotty and Jean never have to worry. That's what Lord Burleigh says. Yeah, and Oxford's like, oh, okay. By 1600, De Vere writes that he is in a deep abyss and bottom of despair, just like in that sonnet, right? No friends, nobody cares about me, nobody respects me. Like, so how did I come to this place? And he almost seems too exhausted at this point to be contemptuous, right? He lived his whole life with this sort of like hard-headed, on fire, screw everybody. But by 1600, he's 50 years old. He's falling apart. He has no money. He's on his way out, right? Emotionally and spiritually and psychologically, if not physically. Nonetheless, he's still trying to get various things just given to him. He writes a letter trying to get a post as governor of Jersey, as president of Wales. He's still trying to get access or control of the tin mines. He keeps trying someone to give him a job where he won't have to do anything, but he can make a bunch of money. That's what he's trying to get. None of this happens. Let's see. He does get called in for the Essex's rebellion. This was a short-lived campaign by Robert Devereux, second Earl of Essex, against Queen Elizabeth. And this actually involved Earl of Southampton, who we mentioned earlier. Earl of Oxford. So there's this plot, right? To overthrow the Queen Elizabeth, and Oxford comes in to be sort of part of one of the sort of jurors on this. He's like the most senior nobleman on this jury to figure out what to do with these people. But it becomes pretty clear by the time it's over, and Oxford makes overtures like, I do this for Queen and country. Who dare to overturn the Queen? Pretty much the reason he's doing that is because once it's decided the fates of the men involved in the Essex's rebellion, he thinks that he'll be able to get his hands on some of their property. That's basically his reason for doing it. And he spends years trying to get his hands on that property, claiming people promised it to him, claiming he deserved it, all these sorts of things. Let's see, 1603, the Queen dies. De Vere, in declining health, manages to get caught up in one more near scandal after her death. Apparently, there were rumors about speaking out. So weirdly enough, the Queen dies, but then Mary, Queen of the Scots, her son is the next rightful heir. And while Queen Elizabeth is on her deathbed, apparently, Oxford was making noises about how the rightful heir is this other guy. What was his name? Henry Hastings, I think. Some other guy, anyway. And Oxford had a relationship with him. So the thinking is Oxford maybe wanted that guy to be on the throne because that guy was his buddy and would hook him up, right? But that's a seditious thing to say. This guy's the rightful heir, and you're talking about this other guy supposed to be king. Um, Apparently, somebody, it's not clear who, maybe William Lord Burleigh's son, who is sort of had become De Vere's caretaker at that point. Somebody signed De Vere's name to the proclamation of King James being king, and De Vere gets out of the whole trouble. It's sort of his last scandal that he's involved in. Um, and then here we go. Let's see. Yeah, this is, I'm just going to read this as a good summary. This is just from Wikipedia, but this is the last little bit. Quote, long weakened by poor health, Oxford passed custody of the Forest of Essex to his son-in-law Francis Norris and his cousin Sir Francis Vere on 18th of June 1604. He died on 24th June of unknown causes at King's Place, Hackney, and was buried on July 6th in the Hackney churchyard of St. Augustine's. Oxford's death passed without public or private notice. His grave was still unmarked in 1612 when his widow Elizabeth signed her will. She asked to be buried in the church of Hackney within the county of Middlesex, as near unto the body of my said late dear and noble lord and husband as may be. And she requested that there be in the said church erected for us a tomb fitting our degree. The 18th Earl of Oxford failed to fulfill his mother's request, and the location of his parents' graves has been lost to time. Now, one little note I just think is interesting, and this is about De Vere's reputation. 4 months after De Vere's death, his daughter Susan, and 4 months after, he's still in the period of mourning, she gets married in an atypically lavish celebration during which, over multiple days, 8 different Shakespeare plays were performed, and William Shakespeare did not attend. Okay. And that's the story of Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford.
Whoa.
Yeah.
I'm De Vere pilled. I'm Oxford pilled.
Okay.
Crazy.
All right.
I hate to concede and say that you won, but I don't know. I want to be convinced the other way. I'm sure there's
we should find like a dyed-in-the-wool Stratfordian to come
real Stratfordian to come on.
Not for an argument, but like present me the case. Yeah.
Yeah. This isn't a competition. Yeah.
No. It's certainly not. I mean, I came into this not having any idea. Like, I don't know. Right. But it is funny. I was talking to some IRL friends about this and a little bit, and one friend goes, "Wait, is this like JFK for book nerds? Like, what is like the JFK assassination for book nerds?" I was like, "Yeah, it basically is." Yeah. So yeah. I mean, that's and we're going to talk in the After Dark about 2 of the other candidates that people have proposed, and there's reasonable arguments for both of them. I think the Oxford case is probably a little stronger, but they're worth looking at. That is Christopher Marlowe, and to me, what's the most interesting, I don't know how realistic it is, but Mary Sidney, the Countess of Pembroke. There's arguments that both either of these people could be.
And that's for our subs and our doms, Substack, Patreon, patreon.com/Art of Dark Pod, Substack.com/ Art of Dark Pod?
Add Art of Dark Pod.
Substack.com/@Art of Dark Pod. Thank you, Brad. Yeah. What is De Vere doing today? Is he he's a maniac.
He's a maniac,
kid in like London, right? Like
right. Yeah, he's a trust fund kid in London with like gangster tendencies, and some amount of tendencies towards the arts, somewhere between having his own troupe of players and writing some poems, and somewhere between that and being the great man of English letters.
And do we think he wrote these plays, or do we? Where do we stand on it now? What do you think?
Yeah. Well, I think probably De Vere was partially responsible for some of them. I think they were probably more of a collaborative effort than I think it gets kind of it gets troubled by this "we want the great man of history" kind of thing. And I'm not somebody who attacks that approach to historiography in general, but I think these were more collaborative than originally thought. I can't 100% say I think De Vere did it. And part of the reason is I hoped to adds something to this discourse. What I found myself falling into, or not myself falling into, what I found myself observing the more time I spent in it is the Oxfordians believe it's Oxford, and the Stratfordians believe it's Stratford. The Oxfordians have better circumstantial evidence, as far as I can tell, but they also tend to ignore all of the Stratfordian arguments. And the Stratfordians do the same. Everybody kind of hand waves over the other sides. And so, yeah, the thing that I came away from this really thinking is that William Shakespeare, the man from Stratford, did not write the plays. That's the one
so
thing
we can rule him out. It was not Colonel Mustard with the spear,
right?
In Stratford.
Right.
Okay.
I'm some percentage on board with the Oxford thesis, but not fully. And I would like to get somebody in here. Like, we should get a real Stratfordian in here.
Yeah. And that is an open invitation, artofdarkpod@gmail.com. We love having guests on for dark rooms. Now that we've done Shakespeare, we should have lots of dark rooms. I want to have my friend Amanda, my theater co-founder Amanda Forstrom, come on to talk about what it's like to act Shakespeare. We have an open door for people, really.
Yeah, and we don't have to just get lost. We don't have to get lost in the Shakespeare Stratford Oxford thing either.
Yeah, we can talk about the work.
Talk about just with the plays and the historical period.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I'm not sure you did this on the episode, so I want to ask, so far anyway, why would they fabricate this?
Well, this is a very good point. So the one reason that Oxford would fabricate it is because, well, for a couple of reasons. One is it was unseemly for a nobleman to be writing plays. Another thing is that he was writing things that were critical or at least satirical of the nobility. And so if he outed himself, then it's clear that, for instance, Lord Burleigh was Polonius, and that would cause all sorts of problems. Later on, why it would sort of continue is that De Vere's descendants were continuing to try and put a buffer between their own family line and nobility, because you're always when you're not like literally the king and queen, you're constantly jockeying for position. And if it turns out that your grandfather or grandfather-in-law was saying these terrible things about the nobility, or things, not even terrible things about them, but mocking them, because you can't even mock them, right? You're muted there. But
yeah, you can't give them a cross-eyed look. I mean, you can't roll your eyes. Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Okay, so you already said that, and then I'll just say that then it would make sense that, for the reasons I suggested, that like this cult would grow up around this vaporware, where you just focus on the work, and then you just assume that the great genius was above reproach.
Right.
And
and
there's
I
nothing
think it's
that
actually,
you can pin. Yeah.
I think it's also interesting to note just sort of sociologically how it functions as let's say it was Oxford and not Shakespeare and not Shakespeare. It is interesting how, like, people often talk about various conspiracy theories, like, well, somebody would spill the beans or people would question it or whatever. You have to give credence to just like the phenomena of inertia. A lot of people are just gonna be like, well, this is what I was told, and so this is what I believe. And if you say something against that, why are you doing that?
The momentum of it grabbing more and more, and it just rolls downhill until it exists as is, and then it would be unthinkable to question differently. Yeah, So many things are like that.
So many, and so it gets to this point where, like, it is are noted Stratfordians caught up in some like conspiracy for big? Not really. I think they just don't ask the question that seems obvious to somebody like a naive person like me wandering in and being like, wait, what? William Shakespeare never wrote a letter? How does that make any sense? He didn't own a book? What? Wait, what? And I'm such a rube that I'm not caught up in the inertia, So anyway, yeah.
We'll be back on the After Dark, patreon.com/artofdarkpod, substack.com/@artofdarkpod. Great job, Brad. That was a lot of fun. I'm Vere Pill.
All right. That makes 1.5 of us. Maybe.